Hello, this is Teresa and I'm back with another card tutorial for Dare to Be Artsy. I'm featuring a magic color slider card using stamps and dies from Dare to Be Artsy. Today I will be using the Holiday Village stamp set and this fancy framelits die set. I will be using the two largest dies. And here is the prototype where I practiced to develop and make sure that I had the measurements and everything just so before doing this tutorial. But don't worry, it's really not that difficult. So if you'll just follow along, I will share everything, all the measurements and everything on the blog for you. So the first thing I'll be showing you is how to recreate this tab slider, and I will go through each part of it step by step. The base that I'm showing you right now is going to be a standard A2 sized base, so the tab that's sliding in and out is smaller than that. The first thing I'm going to do to begin is take an 8.5 piece of white cardstock, and in my case I'm using 110 pound Nina Siller white cardstock. And excuse my head for getting in the way while I make sure to line it up at the 4 1/4 inch mark. So I'm cutting that in half vertically, and then I'm cutting this piece down to 5 1/8 inches in order to start creating the tab that will go on the inside of the slider. So once I've cut that, you can see that that is the basis for starting, and I'm going to cut this down to the same width that I need it to be, including the two small tabs at the bottom. So before I could do that, I actually had to go back and measure exactly what that is. It turns out that measurement is 3 3/4 inch, which I'm writing down, and like I said earlier, I will put a copy of this image so that you can see all the measurements later. So I'm lining this up with 3 3/4 inches on my trimmer, and now you can see it matches the width of the tab that I previously created. And now I'm going to be doing partial cuts into this on each side. So I'm lining it up so that it's up to the 1/4 inch mark there on the right hand side, and I don't cut all the way through. I cut to about 1/4 inch from the bottom, and I repeat this process on the other side so that I will have the two tabs that are sticking out at the bottom. I'm just going to be using my detail scissors to cut off those little pieces, and now I will have the tabs at the bottom that I need in order to keep the slider from coming completely out of the card later. So one of the things that I did to make it easier for the slider to come in and out of the card, especially coming out of the card, is round those corners. And the last piece I will create is a die cut circle out of the same white cardstock so that there is something sticking out of the card for you to pull the slider in and out. And then to attach it, I just pull some liquid glue, attach it to the bottom part of the circle, and then attach that to the slider. And now that I've done that, the slider mechanism is complete, and we can move on to the next step. Now I'm going to be creating the slit that is in the fold of the card base. And in order to make sure that's the correct measurement, I refer back to the tab. And I need a 3 1/4 inch slot at least, but I'm going to make it slightly larger than that. So I'm using the tab in order to mark where I need to start and stop cutting. So I'm putting a pencil mark on just the outside edge of that tab, and then I'm placing the blade down and dragging it across, but not all the way, so that I have a slit in the center of it, just big enough for the tab to go in and out at the top. And then once that is done, I'm adding some tape as reinforcement on each side just to make sure that my cardstock doesn't tear as the slider is used multiple times. So I'm putting that on the inside edge, and it will not be seen on the project when you fold it over. And I used a bone folder to reinforce where I folded the card. And so I test out my slider mechanism, and it looks like the slot at the top is just the right size for it. So I'm moving on to the next step, which is die cutting the aperture or opening in the front of the card. So I'm taking the smaller of the two dies that I'm using from the set. I've die cut that out of the front of the card, and when I remove the tape and the die cut, I will have an aperture or opening in the front of the card to feature the colored image later in the project. And there's the opening, and I fold it, and you can see how this is starting to come together already. So two of the strips that I cut earlier I'm going to be using on one side in order to create a channel for the slider so that it is not coming out from one side or the other, and it has a nice neat track to follow. Now I'm using the piece that I cut the circle out of earlier and just cutting some additional strips off of either side, which I'm going to be gluing on top of each other and trimming, and therefore I'm creating a channel around the sides and the bottom of the inside of that base. So as you can see, I'm just trimming that, and I'm going to be using some glue in order to attach those to each side. One of the things that is important to do is keep that track as close as possible to the very edge of the card base as you can. And the reason I'm putting two layers on here is because I'm going to be coloring the piece that will go on the center of this section of the card later, and I want to make sure there's enough clearance for the slider tab to go in and out later. So as you can see, I'm using my Zig two-way pen, which is perfect for really small strips like this. So this is one of my favorite things to use when I'm trying to do just this very type of task. The last thing I'll need to do is just attach my little strips there at the bottom, and then I will have a nice little channel prepared for the slider tab. And as you'll see me do frequently throughout this process, I will occasionally stop and make sure that everything is still functioning correctly. So if I have to make a course correction, that I still have time to do that. So this is one of those very points. I'm putting the slider back in and making sure that it's actually going to clear the edge. And if it wasn't going to, I could still trim off a little bit on those little tabs on the bottom if I still needed a little bit more room. But it looks like as it is right now, I will not need to do that. It is going to work just fine as it is. Just important when you're working on a project like this to stop every once in a while and just do another check. It helps you keep on track and not be frustrated. If something goes wrong, it's easier to correct it as you're moving along versus later. So at this point, I'm getting prepared to trim down the remaining piece of that 8.5 by 11 piece of cardstock that I began with at the start of the video. I'm going to be doing my stamping and coloring on this piece. So I'm just trimming it down so it is going to fit inside the channel of the slider mechanism. So I'm going to stamp this up with some Copic Safe ink onto that white cardstock, and then I will leave the stamp in the MISTI because I'm going to be stamping it again on top of the acetate that will be going on the front part of the card. So I stamped it twice just to make sure I got a good impression with the black ink. Then I'm going to switch over to a piece of acetate, and I'm cutting it down to roughly an A2 card front size. I will be using Stays On black ink in order to stamp onto the acetate, which is, as far as I know, the only ink that you can use to stamp on acetate and actually dry and not smear. So I'm using the white stamped piece of cardstock to line up the acetate in the MISTI, and I taped it down just to make sure it did not move because I was certain I would need to stamp this more than one time. As it turned out, I was correct. I stamped it the first time, and even though I did apply a lot of even pressure and took the time to make sure it transferred evenly. It still didn't, so it did take a second stamping in order to get all the lines as crisp as I possibly can. It even still, this is not the most perfectly crisp image, but it's just kind of the nature of the thing when using acetate in this ink. It's still, I think I got a pretty good result overall, and I think you'll be pretty happy to see how that turned out too. So here's the colored piece after I finish most of the coloring. I am still in the midst of adding some final details using gel pens and some detail markers, so not necessarily everything I used whenever I started adding some of the final details was necessarily Copic. Some of the parts in this image are so small and detailed, it's really difficult to necessarily use a Copic in some of those spots. So as you can see, I'm adding the effect of snow by using a white gel pen, and I am dotting the entire front of this card, including every place where I've even colored before, just to make it look like snow is falling all over the place. So now I'm about to place that inside of the card base, and I'm preparing to add the piece of acetate where I've already pre-stamped it with the black StazOn ink. Now at this stage, the most critical part of this is making sure that it is aligned as perfectly as you can possibly get it onto the pre-colored image below. And I used some liquid adhesive in this case, just in case the acetate moved after I had it placed and I needed to move it a little bit. And it looks like I got it in place as good as I can possibly get it. And now I'm getting ready to glue down this card. It's not really a card base, but it is going to go on top of another card base when I'm finished. But I am now adding liquid glue around all the sides, except I'm making sure to avoid the tab slider because I still need that to be able to move once this is glued down. And for the front of the card, I want to add some pattern paper, so that this is where I'm bringing in and using the two dies from the Fancy Framelit set. So I'm using this striped pattern paper, and I cut it so that I have a little frame to go on the front around that opening. At first I thought maybe this one piece would be enough, but I realized after getting it on there that it really just didn't quite look right to me. I felt like it still needed to color. There was just too much white space for me, so I had to keep going and doing something to make the front of it not look so bare whenever you're not looking at the colored image. So I found a piece of green polka dotted paper in my stash, and I had already die cut the center out of it, as you can see. I'm using a temporary adhesive, and I'm sorry, my camera is having a lot of trouble focusing at this point for some reason. I wanted to be sure that I got this trimmed exactly right, so I turned the front of it over and marked where I needed to cut it so that it would be an exact match for the front. So I'm trimming down this piece, and once I've done that, I will add some glue around the edges on the card front, and then add this piece around it so that it doesn't look quite so bare on the front. And now I'm just kind of getting it in position, and I will add my liquid glue all around the outside where I've already put the previous piece of pattern paper, and then I will glue down my green pattern paper right on top of that. And since there isn't a lot of room on the outside for a sentiment, I'm stamping on the inside of the card. So I'm using 2 sentiments from this set and stamping them in red ink, and then I will be using the musical bar stamp that is also included in the same set, and I'll be stamping it twice I'll be stamping it above and below the sentiment in black ink, as you can see here. So now that I've got this part just about done, I'm ready to work on putting the entire card together. And what you'll see shortly is I've created a little sentiment strip to put on the front of the card, but it is also from the same stamp set, by the way. I'm using a hot glue gun to attach some ribbon that I pulled out of my stash that matched the colors on the front of the card. And now you can see the slider mechanism and the great big reveal. Isn't that just the coolest thing you ever saw? I hope you really enjoyed today's video. If so, please leave a thumbs up and a comment to let me know what you think. I appreciate your time watching, and until next time, I dare you to be artsy.